Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. I was just telling Senator Casey I was struck by a recent article in The Economist, which refers to Bill Clinton's statements back in March of 2000, where he said American opinion on China was divided into two camps. One he called the optimists, who would see China becoming the next great capitalist tiger with the biggest market in the world. And then he said there were the hawks and pessimists who saw China stubbornly remaining the world's last great communist dragon and a threat to stability in Asia. They conclude that the China Xi Jinping is a great mercantilist dragon under strict Communist Party control, using the power of its vast markets to cow and co-opt capitalist rivals, to bend and break the rules-based order and to push America to the periphery of the Asia-Pacific region. And they conclude that this has led to one of the starkest reversals in modern geopolitics. The focus of today's hearing is on an important international market, the second largest economy, and that is, of course, the country of which I was just speaking, China. Also, the United States' largest trading partner and the third largest export market for U.S. goods abroad. While the legitimate flow of goods and services between the United States and this nation have increased over the years, the statistics alone don't tell the whole story. We must also consider the national security context. Within 7 years, China will pose the greatest threat to U.S. national security of any nation, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As China's population grows and as its economy continues to modernize, the Chinese market will continue to emerge as an attractive one for U.S. businesses seeking the opportunity to serve the Chinese consumer in all sectors. But unfortunately, while Chinese companies enjoy largely unfettered access to the United States market and an economy that's open to investment, U.S. companies are not afforded with reciprocity in this regard. In order to paint a picture of the persisting problem, we have to review the historical context. In the 80s, China first sought entry to the rules-based global trading system known as the World Trade Organization. After years of deliberation and negotiation, an agreement was reached in 2001. This agreement allowed for China's accession to the World Trade Organization if it agreed to comply with a number of free market principles: tariff reductions, equal footing for foreign businesses, and the removal of implicit and explicit barriers to trade. Moreover, China would have to adhere to global principles under the TRIPS agreement to protect and enforce intellectual property rights. Fast forward to 2018, 17 years later, and China has still not lived up to those promises and commitments it made under WTO. China's authoritarian regime, its One Belt, One Road initiative, and its Made in China 2025 plan are part of a comprehensive agenda to promote state-driven industrial policies that distort and disadvantage U.S. firms that are simply seeking free market competition with Chinese companies. U.S. companies seeking to do business in China often always encounter a protectionist system, one that employs predatory practices and promotes domestic subsidized industries over foreign competitors. The U.S. Trade Representative's 2017 report on China's WTO compliance explains that today's situation in China is even worse than it was 5 years ago, as the state's grip on the economy continues to increase. But even more alarming is the fact that U.S. technology companies often report China's blatant attempts to steal sensitive and proprietary intellectual property. In many instances, China has simply used trade as a weapon, coercing U.S. companies to enter into joint ventures and other business agreements that require the company to hand over key technology and know-how, the so-called secret sauce, simply in order to gain market access. This process and practice has already begun to erode America's technological advantage and undermine our defense industrial base. That's why I've introduced legislation, along with Senator Feinstein, called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act to combat this epidemic and modernize the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's also my understanding that President Trump and his administration are currently considering potential temporary actions under existing authority to ensure investment reciprocity and protect U.S. national security, in part because CFIUS, as it currently is enacted, lacks adequate authority under its current statute. China's restricted market is highly concerning, and multiple administrations have attempted to engage China's leaders on their trade practices. China will even send students to American colleges and universities for STEM-related degrees, only to have them return to China and further advance their goals. It's part of their comprehensive strategy. Unfortunately, many rounds of high-level diplomatic talks have not yielded progress, often resulting in commitments made with zero action. Take the latest comprehensive economic dialogue. For example, the 100-day plan on trade yielded commitment from China, most of which have not been followed up on. Discussions may continue in the future, but one thing's clear. China's market access reforms are too slow, and barriers still exist. Reciprocal treatment for U.S. companies should not be too much to ask. Indeed, it's the bare minimum of what we demand. It's my hope that today's hearing will paint a clear picture of the problems that persist with access to China's market and that significant reforms will follow. With that, let me turn it over to Ranking Member Casey.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Cornyn for this hearing and for our witnesses. Whether it's steel or tires or high technology, industries across a state like Pennsylvania and indeed across the country face significant challenges when it comes to China. Whether through forced technology transfer or joint ventures, theft of intellectual property, or straight-up barriers to entry, U.S. firms and manufacturers have been fighting for decades to get the same treatment for American products in China as Chinese exports see in the United States. When Ambassador Lighthizer came before this committee just a couple of weeks ago, he stated in pertinent part in his testimony, quote, "The costs of globalization are falling most heavily on workers," unquote. I'll repeat the last 5 words, quote, "falling most heavily on workers." I couldn't agree more, and it's backed up by the studies by Economic Policy Institute and not too long ago by a study done at MIT by economists David Artur and his co-authors David Dorn and Gordon Hanson. All of these studies lend credence and lend data to that assertion. Just in short summary fashion, the MIT study said that roughly 40% of the decline in U.S. manufacturing just between 2000 and 2007 was due to a surge in imports from China. That's been the experience of Pennsylvania. We've had a record loss in manufacturing jobs over the last generation, economic devastation that none of us could even begin to describe or fully understand. Lives that have been completely destroyed, communities wiped out, trauma and suffering that flow from the job loss, suicides, family breakups, opioid addiction, all kinds of traumas in the aftermath of that kind of job loss. It started to present itself in the 1980s. There was a 4 or 5 year period in the early 1980s where tens of thousands of steelworker jobs were lost in southwestern Pennsylvania. By one estimate, in 5 years or less, half of the steelworker jobs in that region were lost, from about 90,000 to 45,000. And it just continued from there. I have to say that I don't think that in the last 40 years, at least, either party here in Washington has done nearly enough. Neither party, in my judgment, has had a strategy. Neither party has focused on a way forward. And this applies, of course, to multiple presidential administrations and in many sessions of Congress. Workers need an answer for what happened to them and continues to happen to them. U.S. industries have been under a sustained attack from China. Our steel, our aluminum, manufacturing in the past decade, and now China's given us the playbook for their next line of attack. Robotics, rail equipment, advanced medical products, just to name a few. Pennsylvania knows all too well what may be in store for the rest of the country if we don't address the systemic threat that China presents. After the collapse of the steel industry, the city of Pittsburgh found its way back, reinventing itself with the help of civic leaders, foundations, universities who are on the cutting edge in robotics and advanced technology. China, in its 2025 plan that Senator Cornyn referred to, is coming after all of that too. So I'm glad we're having this hearing today, and I hope it begins a much-needed conversation on the type of comprehensive strategy we need to address the threat posed by China. If you don't have a strategy that undergirds the development of an answer, you won't get the result that we all agree on, ensuring U.S. workers have the skills they need to compete, insulating our communities from economic shock, and preventing China from literally stealing our future. Part of that is making sure our communities have access to immediate economic assistance when large job loss or a localized recession occurs, which can happen for any number of reasons outside of trade. The goal is always to prevent economic shocks from happening, but if they do occur, we must respond, and respond quickly. I've put forward a bill on this issue and would welcome the insights of the panel on a future date. China has made no secret about its strategy to push the rules to their limit, and when advantageous, break those rules outrightly. They know that by the time a trade case reaches the conclusion, the damage to an industry has been done. The U.S. needs a sustained and coordinated strategy to address the threat posed by China, and the United States should work with our allies to execute it. This is not a problem unique to the United States, and there is no need to treat it as such. We must address the barriers China puts up that prevent our companies from competing on a level playing field. So I'm glad to be working with Senator Cornyn and others on these critical issues. It's clear that he and so many people in both parties care deeply about this issue. We appreciate our witnesses being here today to help us shed light on this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Casey. I want to take a moment to introduce our witnesses. The first is Mr. Dean Garfield. Mr. Garfield serves as the President and CEO of the Industry Council. Our second witness is Ms. Christine Bliss, who is President of the Coalition of Services Industries. The third panelist is Ms. Linda Dempsey. She's Vice President of International Economic Affairs Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. And our final witness today is Thea Lee. Ms. Lee serves as President of the Economic Policy Institute. Let me join Senator Casey in thanking each of you for being here today and sharing your thoughts with us. I'll start with Mr. Garfield. If each of you would limit your initial presentation to about 5 minutes, we promise you that any additional remarks you have will be made part of the record, but we'd like to get to ask questions and exchange ideas. So, Mr. Garfield, I'll recognize you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Casey, members of the committee. On behalf of 63 of the world's most dynamic and innovative companies that are members of ITI, we thank you for holding this hearing. I can think of no issue more important to America's economic and technological future than the bilateral relationship between China and the United States. We've submitted my testimony for the record, so for purposes of this hearing, I'd like to focus on 3 things. What is at stake and the obstacles we face in China? 2, why we continue to compete in that market. And 3, what the U.S. government, Congress, and the administration can do to help. With regard to the first, which is what is at stake is America's economic and technological future. We are experiencing now innovations like AI, 5G, quantum computing that are some of the most historic in human history. China recognizes that and is doing things that are both legitimate and illegitimate to put its thumb on the scale in favor of its local champions so they can corner the market on the frontier innovations of the future. The list of pernicious protectionist measures is long. Many have even called it a tapestry. So for purposes of this hearing, I'll focus on 3 elements of the quilt. China has become expert in foreclosing strategic elements of its market from foreign competition. A case example of that is in cloud services. 18 of the 20 largest cloud service providers in the world are US-based. Unfortunately, those cloud service providers do not have free and reciprocal access to the Chinese market. In fact, those companies cannot directly engage in cloud services in China. They cannot engage in contracts with Chinese customers, and they cannot operate directly cloud services in China. In fact, China has the most restrictive cloud services rule in the world. In contrast, Chinese companies that provide cloud services have unfettered access to the rest of the world. Second element of the quilt that gives you a sense of the norm in China is China also has become expert in overwhelming companies with an avalanche of vague rules, regulations, standards, and practices that create opportunities for mischief. For example, the 2016 cybersecurity law in China was complemented by an array of rules, regulations that culminate in a cybersecurity review regime that empowers agencies and municipalities to pressure companies to provide access to their source code and as well to transfer sensitive technologies. Our companies have become adept in navigating the straits and avoided turning over their seed corn to the future to China. Nonetheless, in facing those pressures, they certainly operate in that market at a disadvantage. The trifecta in the quilt in China is what you alluded to, Senator Casey, which is the practice in China of making commitments that they don't ultimately keep. China, when it ascended to the WTO, committed to opening up the Chinese market to financial services. Thereafter, China lost a WTO case on electronic payment services, and in 2013 committed to opening up the market. Again, in Mar-a-Lago in 2017, they committed to doing the same and still have not. That may raise the question as to why our companies continue to compete in China. The answer is you cannot be a global company and ignore 1/5 of the world's population. It would be akin to Starbucks saying they're going to have a store on every corner with the exception of California, Pennsylvania, and Texas. It just doesn't make sense. As well, in the tech sector, in order to acquire customers, you must compete globally, which means also competing in California. So the choice for our companies is competing in China or not competing at all. Our companies have chosen to compete. And that is in part why we need the assistance of both Congress and the administration. What we recommend is twofold, which fit in a singular basket, which both Senator Cornyn and Senator Casey raised, which is we need a broader strategy that has 2 pillars. One is making sure that we're working with our allies to advance our interest with China. And what that means at this moment is focusing more on building that coalition, getting to the bargaining table with China, and putting in place timelines and accountability mechanisms to make sure that we're changing their behavior. So focusing more on that and less on tariffs. Finally, what it means is investing more here in STEM and the other essentials for being successful in those areas of frontier innovation. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Garfield. Ms. Bliss?
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Casey, subcommittee members, I appreciate the opportunity to present the views of the Coalition of Services Industries, which represents a wide spectrum of services sectors, from financial services to ICT services to professional services, media and entertainment, logistics, just to give you a sense of the breadth of who we represent. China was the United States' second largest export market in 2017 and is one of the fastest growing markets for U.S. services. But we need to make sure that we can take advantage of those opportunities. So I want to highlight some particular areas of concern, and they're going to overlap with a couple of the areas, if not all the areas, that Dean mentioned in his testimony as well. just to demonstrate how incredibly important digital trade is for the economy as a whole, and certainly the services sector. In information and technology services, China fails to provide non-discriminatory market access for a broad range of online services, requiring joint venture partners for online services, and then failing to issue the necessary licenses to provide those services. On cloud services, which again you just heard highlighted, the United States should secure China's commitment that it will allow U.S. cloud service providers to provide all the necessary licenses for the operation and provision of cloud services, remove existing investment restrictions, permit U.S. cloud services to use their trademarks and brands and to sign contracts for the provision of cloud services, and enable U.S. cloud services providers to procure telecommunications services for the provision of cloud services on a non-discriminatory basis. China also maintains barriers to cross-border provision of video and music services, as well as cross-border data services, including virtual private networks. And more broadly, and of great concern, China blocks a wide range of legitimate U.S. websites and services. China's cybersecurity law is another area of concern that has the potential to create additional discriminatory barriers, and particularly with respect to its requirement that personal data be stored domestically, and the fact that it is as vague and broad as it is has created confusion and uncertainty as to how it will exactly apply and to what types of data will it apply. Before highlighting China's financial services barriers, I just want to thank Finance Committee members, including Senators Cornyn, Scott, Heller, and Crapo, Portman and Cassidy, Isaacson and Thune, for your September 17th letter to the administration highlighting the barriers in trade and investment that face financial services. Currently, to illustrate, there is a 50% cap on foreign equity in life, health, and pension companies that has existed since China entered the WTO in 2001. China's 2017 announcement that it would allow 51% foreign ownership in Chinese life insurance companies in 3 years and lift that restriction entirely in 5 years is very welcome. But the key here is implementation and follow-through. China has not authorized any U.S. investment in the enterprise annuities sector, and there's a 33% cap in the securities sector. There is also an unlevel playing field in the banking sector, as U.S. banks are subject to a 20% investment ceiling for single foreign shareholders and a 25% investment limit for multiple foreign shareholders in local Chinese banks. China has announced that it will increase foreign direct investment in domestic securities firms from 49% to 51%, with a commitment to remove that 51% cap within 3 years. Electronic payment services, another area that we share in common with the comments made by ITI, is a very important area. In 2017, in the U.S.-China 100-day action plan, one of the commitments China made was to open the domestic market for U.S. electronic payment services. There are several U.S. EPS suppliers that have filed license applications. They remain pending, and we urge China's commitment to full and prompt market access for U.S. EPS suppliers. In conclusion, we believe that in order to fully realize the tremendous potential that Chinese market represents requires not only that specific services and investment barriers be addressed, but we think there must be systemic changes across the Chinese economy. And that CSI believes this can be best achieved by ensuring that the U.S. establishes a clear framework for engaging in bilateral negotiations with China with defined objectives, a timetable, and close coordination with our allies. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to present our testimony.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dempsey?
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Casey, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on manufacturers' views on market access challenges in China. The National Association of Manufacturers, the NAM, is the largest and oldest manufacturing association in the United States, representing over 14,000 manufacturers in every industrial sector in all 50 states. Manufacturing employs 12.6 million women and men across the country, contributing a record $2.25 trillion to the U.S. economy in 2017. U.S.-China commercial relations are a top priority given both the challenges and the opportunities this relationship presents. It is fair to say that our nation's relationship with China is complicated, very complicated. On the one hand, there are few places in the world where manufacturers in the United States export more or have increased sales more. As a result of China's lowering of tariffs, implementation of many of the rules of the WTO system, manufacturers in the United States have been able to export more goods to China than to any other country outside of our NAFTA partners, Canada and Mexico. Manufacturers exported nearly $96 billion in goods in 2017, which in turn supports hundreds of thousands of U.S. manufacturing jobs. Exports of made-in-the-USA manufacturing goods to China have grown more than $76 billion since 2002, more than to any other country besides Canada and Mexico. Similarly, our friends in the agricultural sector have seen similar levels of growth, which helps manufacturers sell to our domestic farmers in terms of equipment, fertilizer, seed, cold storage, and the list could go on. This is especially important for manufacturers because more than half of the manufacturing workers depend for their paychecks on exports overseas. But on the other hand, there are few places in the world where trade has proven more challenging for American manufacturing. We face substantial, unfair, discriminatory, and distortive practices in China that are harming U.S. manufacturing and manufacturing workers and are holding our country back. Among the most troublesome issues on which I expanded in my written testimony are localization policies, such as Made in China 2025, that discriminate against U.S. companies, intellectual property rights and enforcement that are insufficient for the 21st century, standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures that limit our basis to compete on a fair and equal basis in China, subsidies and other measures that distort the market and create damaging and unsustainable overcapacity, investment restrictions that depress market access and foster harmful technology transfer, state-owned enterprises that create unfair and uncompetitive conditions of competition, tariffs and other import regulations that block U.S. exports, and transparency and the rule of law issues. While some of these challenges can be addressed through the existing WTO rules, others require new approaches. The question is how best to address them. We at the NAM believe it is time, long past time, to undertake a truly comprehensive and focused strategy designed to achieve the best outcomes for American workers and enterprise. That means pursuing a modern, innovative, and comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with China that wholly restructures our economic relationship. As NAM President and CEO Jay Timmons explained in a letter to the President on January 8th, to be successful, such a free and fair trade agreement must eliminate barriers that unfairly block American companies and American manufacturing exports from full access to the Chinese market, raise standards in China, and create new rules to prevent the wide range of market-distorting practices that violate free markets and fair competition and hurt American businesses and workers, and create clear mechanisms to mandate strong and binding enforcement of the agreement, providing channels for the government and industry alike to address cheating and violations. This is at once both a radical and, in our view, the most effective and pragmatic way forward. This approach must also be combined with ongoing enforcement of the WTO rules to which China has committed, usage of U.S. trade remedy rules to address unfair trade practices that are harming our industries and workers, and intensive work with our trading partners to address systemic challenges that are undermining trade globally. Targeted actions such as tariffs can provide some relief in the short term to some manufacturing industries, but they harm others in the form of significant added costs or provoke China to take further destructive actions. Ultimately, we think it is best to address directly the systemic issues that have given rise to the underlying challenges in the first place. The U.S.-China commercial relationship has provided significant opportunities for the American economy and manufacturers. As a massive and growing market, it holds the promise of continuing to do so. But to achieve that, to be sustainable, the trading relationship simply must be more fair and more open. That's exactly what a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with China would help achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lee?
Thank you, Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Casey, members of the subcommittee, for the invitation to participate in this important hearing today. I am the president of the Economic Policy Institute, the nation's premier think tank analyzing the effects of economic policy on America's working families. 17 years after China acceded to the WTO, the bilateral economic relationship between our two countries is enormously lopsided and problematic. The U.S. goods deficit with China is the single largest bilateral deficit between any two countries in the history of the world, and it continues to trend upward, despite more than 20 U.S. challenges to China at the WTO, despite earnest annual bilateral talks and commitments, and despite all the reform commitments China made upon accession. Furthermore, it's not just the sheer size of the trade imbalance with China that is of concern. It is the composition. The U.S. ought to be a leader in advanced technology products. A wealthy, technologically savvy, high-skilled, capital-intensive country like the United States would be presumed to have a comparative advantage in ATP. However, the U.S. runs annual deficits in advanced technology products of over $100 billion, and that is entirely accounted for by China. That is to say, we have a trade surplus in ATP with the rest of the world. This one fact alone should be a signal that there are significant anomalies in the U.S. trade relationship with China that cannot be explained by market forces. Overall, top U.S. exports to China include raw materials, agricultural products, and waste materials, as well as aerospace, while our imports are concentrated in computers, electronics, miscellaneous manufactured commodities, and apparel. This is not the profile of imports and exports that would be expected between countries at the respective economic development levels of China and the U.S. According to USTR, China is still not fully compliant with the commitments it made during the WTO accession process, as has been talked about today. American companies trying to do business in China face theft of trade secrets, counterfeiting, inadequate protection of intellectual property, online piracy, industrial policies that promote domestic goods at the expense of U.S. products, subsidies, discriminatory product standards, the dumping of excess capacity, and restricted access for American services. 17 years after accession, China has not even listed all of its restricted export subsidies, let alone eliminated them, as was promised. In addition, China has used currency policies to gain an unfair competitive advantage over American business and labor. This litany of unfair trade practices, together with currency manipulation, has had a serious negative impact on American jobs and wages. As my colleague Rob Scott has shown, the U.S. trade deficit with China cost jobs in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, while also putting downward pressure on the wages of manufacturing workers and, in fact, all non-college graduates. It is no secret that the Chinese government has a long-term economic strategy to build certain sectors through subsidies as well as through purchasing, tax, and regulatory policies. These plans set targets for indigenous production, use of technology, favorable treatment for state-owned enterprises, and discriminatory treatment of foreign brands and companies, among other things. These practices are deep and pervasive. There are two problems here, and we should be careful to distinguish them. On the one hand, many of the Chinese government's practices are inconsistent with international rules and norms, not just the WTO, but also international conventions on workers' rights, public health, human rights, environmental protections, intellectual property rights, and consumer safety. The U.S. touts the importance of a rules-based system. But if some players, like China, flout the rules with impunity over decades, then the rules-based system becomes a trap for those who comply. The U.S. government's piecemeal and scattershot enforcement strategy has been time-consuming and ineffective as well as uneven. For example, our government has not even raised in any significant or meaningful way China's failure to comply with its obligations as a member of the International Labor Organization. This means that American workers and businesses are competing on a tilted playing field, since Chinese workers cannot exercise their rights to form independent and democratic unions. The Chinese government is clearly playing a long game, while the U.S. is egregiously short-sighted. Our trade policies have been so inadequate in scale and slow in implementation, that by the time we take action, it is often a decade too late, with the result that our trade actions are ineffective, if not counterproductive. We need to reform our domestic trade laws so we can act expeditiously. Going forward, we must address new barriers to trade and services and e-commerce. We need to make sure that we have and are willing to use measures to address currency misalignment. Our trade enforcement measures should prioritize good jobs, workers' rights, democracy, environmental compliance, and consumer safety over outsourcing and short-term profits. In summary, the U.S. government needs to develop and articulate its own long-term economic development strategy. It needs to use domestic tax, infrastructure, workforce development policies to ensure that American workers and businesses have the tools and the skills they need to compete successfully. But our government also needs to strengthen our trade compliance and enforcement measures and be willing to use them aggressively and consistently and in a timely manner to ensure that our trade relationship with China is both reciprocal and fair. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee. We'll be doing 5-minute rounds with questions, and I'll start. Maybe, Mr. Garfield, I'll start with you. It strikes me that most Americans, when they look at China, they don't fully appreciate the fact that this is a country under Communist Party control, and that one of the motivations of the party and of the country are to grow their economy for obvious reasons, but also to control their people and to further their surveillance on their own people by, for example, maintaining data on their people in their country and not make it available more broadly, because that undermines their goal of control. But also to, in their approach to stealing intellectual property or through creative investments, getting access to not only the intellectual property but the know-how in order to build a product, maybe that's been invented here in the United States. They do threaten American jobs because they undermine the industrial base here, and if they can make it in China using Chinese workers, obviously that's to the detriment of American workers. So when you think about how we look at China, is that an accurate description, or do you see some differences?
I think it's fair, even when you're on the ground in China, which I've been double-digit times, it's often easy to forget you're in a market that's state-operated and controlled, with that as a fundamental pillar of their existence. I don't think that difference alone suggests that we shouldn't be engaging with China. I think what it suggests is, given the level of state control and their desire to maintain control over their population, the United States also has to play the long game and develop a strategic outlook that has in mind leveraging our strategic advantages.
Well, Ms. Bliss, let me ask you, given what Mr. Garfield has said, and I don't disagree with him at all, how do you embrace, how do we get China to embrace a rules-based regime where the rule of law is applied impartially no matter who's involved, when it seems so committed to its overall goal of economic growth and undermining any advantage the United States has? For example, as the USTR's 2017 report on China's WTO compliance track record said the U.S. erred in supporting China's interest in the WTO on terms that have been proven ineffective. I mean, the reason why China was accepted in the WTO is the idea that they would then have to comply with WTO policies and decisions and rules. If you don't recognize those rules as authoritative or controlling, how do we deal with China?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I think there are a couple of ways that we respond. And I would agree, as I said in my oral statement, and I think you've heard from other witnesses this morning, that we very much support playing, as Dean said, the long game, in the sense that we believe there needs to be an established process where we get the Chinese to sit down at the negotiating table with well-defined objectives and a timetable, but we do that in concert with our allies and in order to exert maximum pressure. I also think that we avail ourselves, which I think the United States has been doing, but could also step up, of existing commitments under the WTO. And I would say that there are some examples of where our hope is that the WTO commitments and the dispute settlement process will ultimately yield positive results in this area. And the example I would give is the electronic payment services, where China not only lost the case, was informed by a WTO panel that it was inconsistent with its WTO commitments, but then in the 100-day initiative recommitted to address that and to allow U.S. EPS suppliers into the market. There are now, as I'm sure you're aware, a number of those license applications pending. And our view is now is the time to ensure that China follows through on those commitments and issues those licenses. So that's one example where I know you question the effectiveness of the WTO, but I think there's an opportunity to show that it can be effective with China. Secondly, I think in the administration's current 301 response, where they've indicated their decision to take forward an aspect of that with respect to licensing to the WTO, that is another example where we can take advantage of WTO rules in forcing China to really live up to its commitments. But finally, I would say that we are concerned under the current environment that we don't think that turning to things like escalating tariff threats are going to be an effective way to secure meaningful systemic reform in China. So I think the bottom line in our view is long-term, consistent pressure to negotiate, working with our allies with clearly defined objectives, and using tools that are available to us, which we continually believe are effective, and we would include in that the WTO.
Senator Casey.
Thanks very much. I wanted to start with Ms. Lee. I was glad that you focused in part of your testimony about the impact on jobs and wages here in the U.S. We've heard these numbers so many times, so many different versions of them, and the enormity of them, I think, escapes our imagination. There's a growing body of research that, in addition to the work that EPI has done, and we appreciate that work, the MIT study I mentioned in my opening about just a 7-year period, 40% of the decline in U.S. manufacturing attributable to a surge in Chinese imports. So, can you discuss the impact in terms of not just jobs but also in wages? U.S. wages, I should say.
Thank you very much, Senator. And this is a really important issue, and it's one that I think got a lot more attention when David Otter and his colleagues at MIT did their study, which was very carefully done. They were looking at counties that were importing a lot of the products that we import from China, and they were measuring the impact on jobs and wages. And one of the things I think that's not well understood, people talk about the benefits of free trade, but I think even economists understand that there is that there are winners and losers, but the magnitude of the difference is, I think, part of what's important, which is there can be very small net economic gains and there can be very large distributional impacts. And I think that is what we see from the trade relationship with China. It's not entirely out of what we would expect from economic theory. Danny Roderick at the Kennedy School has said it could be as much as 5 to 1, that the dislocation and the disruption and the distributional impact could be 5 times greater than the net gains. And so this is something, one of the points I made, but it's not just the workers who lose their jobs because of imports from China or because of outsourcing to China, but this is a labor market. And so workers who are not directly impacted, who do not directly lose their job, could also be impacted by downward pressure on their wages. So even service sector workers who are not in the traded sector could feel that impact. And that is really a massive effect on the U.S. labor market.
Mm-hmm. So the wage impact is substantial, huh?
Very substantial, and in some ways more important than the number of jobs that are directly displaced.
No city in the United States can claim to have the recipe as to how to recover from huge job loss. Pittsburgh's done as good a job as any, I think, in modern history. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because they had a guidebook. They had to do a lot of trial and error, invest in technology. They had big institutions, medical research, big universities, foundation support, public-private efforts, a whole range of things that were done. But if you look at not just the Pittsburgh circumstance, but just more broadly, what do you think we need to do to confront this challenge in terms of what we can do affirmatively in addition to confronting China? And I guess the more particular way of talking about it is, how do we keep our workforce more competitive?
Thank you for that question. I think, if we think about it as the supply and the demand side, on the supply side, I think that is the responsibility of the U.S. government to invest more heavily in retraining and education and skills for American workers. The U.S. government, compared to other governments, especially in other industrialized nations, underinvests in our workforce. And that's something that we continue to see in the most recent budgets. And so that's an easy place to start. But also, I think we need to make sure that we are building those supply chains and the manufacturing extension partnership, that we are supporting cutting-edge manufacturing. We don't need to keep all manufacturing here, but the United States should have a competitive edge in really advanced manufacturing. And there are apprenticeship programs for advanced manufacturing skills that I know the AFL-CIO has invested in that could be really important. There's programs like the Jobs to Move America, which is helping to tie public transit purchases to rewarding companies that are producing those trains in the United States and using American workers and training those workers and really investing in their workforce. So I think those are the kinds of programs that we should be looking at, in addition to making sure that our trade policy is fair and that we are enforcing the trade laws that we have on the books.
I'm just about out of time. Maybe I'll go to the other panel members on the next round, but thank you.
Senator Grassley.
Yeah. Instead of asking questions, I'd like to reflect on a trip I had with Daines and Johnson and Purdue and SAS to China a couple weeks ago. We visited 5 cities. We didn't visit any of the rural part of the state or of the country. And Daines, Johnson, and Purdue have been to China many times as business, connected with businesses. So they know better than I do about China and what they do that way. But I had various ideas about China before I went there, and all I can say is they were made very real to me, some assumptions I had, like being one in their status as a developing nation to still be considered. That doesn't meet the common sense test. I think a common sense test for me was, if they wanted to do business their business is doing business in the United States, they're the second largest economy in the world. We're the largest. If they want to do business in our country, we ought to be able to do business on the same basis in their country. That's just what common sense tells me. If China was the 50th the 50th largest economy in the world, that'd be a whole different story. But number 1 and number 2 ought to be able to see things pretty much. I kind of came away with the opinion that they'll do anything legal or illegal, anything moral or immoral, anything ethical or unethical, to do whatever they want to get ahead and to stay ahead. And I had a chance with the political leaders in each one of these 5 cities. Each of us had an opportunity to present our views and ask for their rebuttal. I said I'm one of the few members of the United States Senate that is still in the Senate that voted for China to be in the WTO. I thought it was a very good thing that they be in the WTO, and I suppose I still think that they ought to be in the WTO and live, because that signifies living by the trade rules that we have under our international organizations. And I said, it hasn't turned out the way that I anticipated by you violating all these rules and doing what you do to foreign competition. And I said, you know, I kind of feel like I should be sorry for my vote. And of course, they assured me I shouldn't be sorry for my vote. And then you keep hearing from them, well, we want to have dialogue with the United States. Well, we've been having dialogue with them for a long, long time. I told them, my view, you know, not that they're going to listen to me, but they have to hear me, what I think. You know what needs to be done? You just ought to do it. But they are, as you said, I think, Ms. Lee, very strategic, and we're very short-sighted. That's our fault. But if you want to do business in that country, do you have to, and you have to give them all your trade secrets? They steal our trademarks. They make fake products. They violate our everything. And so I'll end with this, that whoever one of you said that we need new laws, I'd like to have my colleagues look at a bill that Senator Brown and I have put in that would take a lot of what countries want to do here into consideration, particularly if they're going to buy into the United States and buy our research and development and all that sort of stuff. Then lastly, the former governor of Iowa has a chance to, or is now the ambassador to China, and I've saw him at several of our meetings over there. But I came to this conclusion from visiting with Chinese political leaders because of his 30-year relationship with President Xi, and from American business people over there, as well as our foreign service officers. I got a feeling that he was the right choice for the President of the United States to choose to be our ambassador there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Roberts?
I don't know if I can top that. Although I understand, Mr. Chairman, that you did invite Mr. Smoot and Mr. Hawley to come and testify.
They were
I don't
busy.
see them. I don't know if they're in the audience or not, but I do recall, I knew them, but Senator Grassley worked with them at that particular time. Ms. Dempsey, you're the only witness that brought up agriculture, and I appreciate that, although there was a connection, I think, with Ms. Bliss, too, and I do appreciate the two pillars and the testimony of all the witnesses. China's obviously, Mr. Chairman, been at the forefront of the trade policy agenda here in recent weeks or months, for that matter. Most significant has been the administration's enforcement actions now, following the conclusion of investigations regarding Section 232, steel and aluminum imports, and Section 301, the intellectual property and technology transfer practices, which have been referred to by all of the witnesses. But as we have seen numerous times, Mr. Chairman, agriculture is often the first industry impacted when retaliatory measures are enacted. And with the recent announcement of Chinese tariffs on U.S. products, many of which are agriculture products, they're the first ones that they pick on or pick. It is clear that history may be repeating itself. I hope that's not the case. The U.S. exported nearly $20 billion in agriculture products to China in 2017. That made it one of the top export markets for U.S. agriculture. But let me point out that over the last 3-4 years, farm prices are down 40%. Farm income is down 52%. So when we have a tariff that is announced in response to whatever negotiations are going on, and all of a sudden we find out in response to washing machines and solar panels, sorghum producers in my state, whose price was above the cost of production, all of a sudden find out their basis points are down to 80%. Boom, just like that. And in the second place, as we keep going with that now, with the additional, I don't know what to call it, I guess, measures that the President has mentioned and that the administration, as mentioned, Wilbur Ross, Mr. Navarro, and Bob Lighthizer. I had a long talk with Bob Lighthizer about this here just the other night. And some of us are going up to the White House tomorrow. Obviously, we're involved in agriculture, and we're worried about the retaliation. And here we had the soybean market off 17%. The sorghum producers that I mentioned, when I was at the White House, they were in my office. And when I came back, they said, "What in God's name did you do?" You know, I said, "Hey, it wasn't me, Coach." You know, but one farmer was in tears. He said, "We just went. You know, I had to sell at this particular time." So you can see the ramifications here. So during an already challenging time for farmers, ranchers, drastic trade policy measures will have a compounding effect on producers in rural America. Everybody up and down Main Street is nervous about trade, everybody in the food chain and all the lenders. By the way, Senator Casey, and by the way, Senator Casey is a senator I really respect. He's a very valuable senator on the sometimes powerful Senate Agriculture Committee. And I understand your plea for workers with regards to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is also a big ag state. And farmers and ranchers and growers are also workers, and they work them down to dust. And I hope we don't get into a situation where one is pitted against the other. That's not what we should do. Now, what has the administration proposed here in terms of proposing tariffs? I think the President has signaled, at least in the press, and we'll learn about that possibly tomorrow, about using the Commodity Credit Corporation and using money to offset some of the problems that we have experienced with regards to prices in the farm sector. We don't need that. We do not want another subsidy program. What we want is a market. We have to sell our product. We have to sell things we make, but we also have to sell things that we grow. And we're in a rough patch in agriculture today. So I'm very hopeful, and any witness that wants to can comment about this, but I hope we don't go down that road of creating some very cumbersome and very difficult to implement, if not impossible, program from the CCC. What do you think about, the President mentioned this sometime back, hasn't mentioned it since. I hope maybe after tomorrow he'll mention it again. How about the 11 countries that joined on the TPP program? What about making efforts to get back in sync with the TPP if there's ever an opportunity for the United States to plant the American flag and also have their back and also increase trade propositions all throughout the Pacific? It would be that. That would be my best suggestion, that either that or, well, both, sell something or else signal that we're interested in getting back with the TPP. Would any of you like to comment?
Maybe I can start. I mean, the National Association of Manufacturers had wanted to see a strong TPP go forward, and we're disappointed that it did not. If there's an opportunity for the United States to get back as part of the TPP, I think that's important. It would set the rules of the international trading system. We also, though, think we have to take this moment with China. We have to act urgently to get new rules of the road. When China joined the WTO in 2001, the rules were written in 1994 for most of it, right? We didn't have an internet. We didn't have the digital economy and the cyber issues. We didn't have the growth in trade that we've now seen today. We've got to get China at the negotiating table, not just dialogues where statements are issued. We've got to get them at the negotiating table to an agreement that's fully enforceable. And if we can do that through working with our TPP partners, but we've also got to do that bilaterally.
Is it okay?
Well, thank you for your comments. My time has long since expired. Where I wrote this down, exactly what you said, searching for it.
I think, Mr. Garfield, you had a comment you wanted to respond to Senator
I'm,
Roberts.
I'm sorry, Mr. Garfield, please.
I think your point about farming is an apt one. One of the things that has been surprising about the discussion over the last 3 weeks around China is how much it's unified the broad business community across 3 pillars, I would say. One is the need to redefine the relationship with China. What we're doing is simply not sustainable. Second, the importance of doing things that work, which mean avoiding tariffs. They haven't worked since McKinley or Smoot-Hawley and won't work now. And then third is doing all of the things that we've been talking about in alignment here on the panel, which is developing a strategy and pushing China with clearly defined dates and accountability metrics. When China acceded to the WTO, there were no timelines against which China would do the things that it committed to do. In fact, 2 days ago, President Xi recommitted for the 5th time for China to open up its financial services sector. And so unless we push China to commit to a date certain and have a metric for measuring whether they're doing it, we'll simply continue to repeat the current cycle.
Well, let me just close by saying that I agree with the President, I agree with everybody that has said, all of the witnesses, that long-term, and it's going to have to be a long-term policy with regards to China. You're not going to have systemic change in China. That may be an oxymoron. I hope it isn't. But that's one thing. But short-term, for goodness sakes, don't, in this business of playing your cards and trying to get a better deal for the United States or a better trade situation, don't do so at the expense of American agriculture, which is going through a very difficult time. And I don't like this business of using farmers and workers as pawns in this particular game, because every sector of ag now is in trouble, and they're worried to death and very nervous about that future. And I want to thank you all for your comments. Sorry for going overboard.
Senator Cardin.
Well, Mr. Chairman, first, thank you for convening this hearing, and I thank all of our witnesses. And I just want to underscore the point that Senator Roberts made. I recently took over as the ranking Democrat on the Small Business Committee, and farmers are small business owners, and over half of our exporters to China are small businesses. So what concerns me as we talk about these policies concerning China, and companies have to adjust, if you're a small business owner, it's almost impossible to adjust. So I would hope we could get some suggestions as we talk about how we engage on trade, our sensitivity to small business owners that are engaged in export international trade, because they really are getting caught without any ability to handle the consequences of these trade discussions. I don't know if any of you have any suggestions focused on small businesses, but I would welcome that.
Maybe I'll start. Over 90% of the NAM's members are small and medium-sized businesses, and actually one of our small business members of our board of directors was on the House Small Business Committee today talking exactly about these types of trade issues. I mean, small business owners, certainly for manufacturers, face many of the same challenges that bigger companies do, but they face more challenges because they don't have outside legal teams, inside legal teams, and the whole support network to deal with these challenges.
So how do we help them? How does the USTR, how does the trade discussions be sensitive to our smaller companies?
The 3 items that our small business colleague mentioned today at the Small Business Committee on the House side were making sure that we have strong and enforceable trade agreements, right, with clear rules. They're in China and facing multiple changes to medical equipment regulations and different standards. That's really hard for a small business owner to compete. They've done great in terms of exports to China. Will that continue? That's hard. If we can get China to agree to strong, accountable rules, that's part of it. The other piece for us is getting things like our export-import back into full functionality, and would like to see the Senate move forward expeditiously on the nominees that are awaiting confirmation. The other thing is the Small Business Administration has programs like the STEP program and other trade promotion activities. Our trading partners overseas, our friends and allies and those that aren't, do a heck of a lot more to help their small businesses export and participate, market intelligence and assistance than we do here in the United States. We've got to look really clear-eyed about ways that we can use the resources we have. We have excellent resources at the Commerce Department, our foreign service officers that Senator Grassley was talking about. Those, making sure that those activities and that those those activities are coordinated with the states, right? Because the states do a lot of export promotion now too. But clear rules, defined rules, that type of support, and certainty. And that's why trade agreements and those types of things are so important.
I think that's helpful. I want to get to Ms. Bliss for 1 second. I appreciate your testimony and the response to some of the questions. I just want to get to the overall strategies we have on China that I think is not well understood, primarily because of the President's lead on general tariffs on steel and aluminum under Section 232, and then coming under Section 301 against China specific, where we have legitimate problems against China on intellectual property, but it gets confused as to whether we're going after specific problems in countries or whether we are just trying to protect our domestic industries, as seen by the international community and the credibility of our programs. We did not use an anti-dumping claim this go-round, which is better understood and is specific to a country. Instead, we use a general tariff. And I just would like to get your view as a person who was in the USTR as to how this affects America's credibility globally, working with our trading partners to understand our policies in regards to China, which we have legitimate concerns about, but the manner that we're going about packaging that international trade policies.
Well, thank you, Senator. In that regard, I think, as I've said, that certainly wearing both maybe my old USTR hat, but also at CSI, we honestly think that it is critically important at this stage to clearly define what the objectives are. Now, a lot of that work has been done because there was tremendous work put into the 301 investigation with respect to tech transfer and IP. So I think there's no question that measures have been looked at, have been identified. But I think in terms of pressing forward on what should be accomplished, there still needs to be a roadmap. And I think that's what we've been really waiting to see in terms of what are the specific objectives, what's the timetable, what happens if those objectives are not reached. And I think a critical part of that, as I've said, is working with our allies, which I think the United States government does to a great degree. But I think now more than ever.
We didn't in regards to the steel and aluminum.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about China right now.
But it came right after steel and aluminum.
Right. No, I understand that. But I'm just saying that to be effective and focusing specifically on China, I think working with our allies, and even though it's out of my area of expertise at this point, I think the same could have been done with respect to steel and aluminum, although that issue seems to be working itself out. I would say, and I just wanted to add that I think services is an important part of the trade picture in going forward and figuring out where the benefits are.
I agree with you. I think their rules on and our penetration in services is so low compared to our capacity to be involved in services in China, and their rules on investment limitations, et cetera, are just so protectionist. We clearly need to take actions. But I guess my point is that that's how we should be going after China, where we have very strong claims that are understood by the international community, rather than using, again, the broad stroke as we started with aluminum steel.
I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, and they were very clear about their interest in working with the United States on these issues. And our colleagues are heading to Japan and Korea next week. And the interest in partnering and working with the United States is high. The concern they have is that they don't see the broader strategy, and they think the focus is solely on tariffs, which our allies are not interested in. And so if we can make clear that there's a broader strategy and that it goes beyond tariffs, I think we would be surprised at the number of nations that are willing to work in collaboration with us.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists for being here this afternoon. Certainly, our trade approach perhaps is unorthodox at this moment. I do think that we are going beyond the trade scope. I think I break it down to 3 T's, Mr. Chairman: the trade, tariffs, and theft. And perhaps we're conflating some issues at times, but really long term, I think the President's objective is to make sure that we're still in business in the next generation. And if we allow the theft to continue from an IP perspective, that we will find ourselves wishing we would have addressed it differently in the past, looking back a generation from now. I think the importance of goods in this conversation cannot be emphasized enough. I come from South Carolina, a state where we were fairly anti-trade for 100+ years, and in the last decade or 2, maybe 3, we've seen a renaissance. So now we have BMW that exports 100,000+ cars from South Carolina to China. We are building the new Volvo plant. We have the country's largest exporter, Boeing, in my backyard, Mercedes as well. So we have a lot of folks who are focused and interested in the goods part of the trade conversation. I'm on the banking committee, and so I spend a little time on the services part as well. And I think as we look at the portfolio of who we are as Americans and what we will produce in the future, 75% of the U.S. private sector is in services. About $731 billion of our exports are services. About 80% of our GDP, services. So while we spend a lot of time, and we should, on the goods component or aspect of our trade conversation, it is truly important that we spend a fair amount of time on the future economy of this country, which will be driven by our services and our ability to engage this world around those services. Now, I would note that our services trade surplus with China has grown from, in 2007, $1.3 billion to 2017, around $38 billion. Now, this is just a smidgen, which is Southern for small. Now, I know that kind of confuses people sometimes, but the fact of the matter is that we're growing in the right direction, and if we get the rules right with China, we can grow exponentially faster in a shorter period of time. That growth would be better, as Mr. Garfield, you were just talking about, making sure that we hold the folks in China accountable for the timelines that they set out. And to that, if you think about China prohibits American firms in banking and insurance from establishing wholly owned operations by capping their ownership levels. Of course, when the Chinese financial services providers come here, they do not face the same barriers. And so the conversation around reciprocity, I think, is actually a healthy conversation and a necessary one. In November, China announced plans to remove its foreign ownership equity caps in financial services over the next 3 years. President Xi reiterated those comments this week. Good news, I think, Mr. Garfield. Maybe not good enough, Ms. Bliss. I'm going to ask you to answer a question. 2 questions for you. Number one, that when you're focused on China's approach to services, I think there's a lot of fine print in the contracts that we have to pay close attention to. My understanding is that China's Securities Regulatory Commission is currently writing draft rules to implement these changes. Is there something we should watch for that would not allow U.S. firms to compete on a level playing field as promised? Do you think the 3-year roadmap is a realistic one? Ms. Bliss, if you start, and anyone else wants to jump in my 45 seconds that I have left. I have noted, however, that we typically give each senator 12 minutes in this hearing, and I appreciate that.
We'll come back for another round.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott, and for your comments about services, because certainly one of our missions at CSI is to educate about the role of services in the economy and the very positive role that it has in job creation and in good jobs and jobs of the future in particular. But let me turn specifically to financial services. I think we see the notion of, certainly with respect to life insurance, China has talked about lifting the 51% cap that it's agreed to go to entirely in 5 years. So we see that as a positive development. And with respect to securities, similarly, we look to, in a positive way, to the timetable for that to be lifted. And I think the answer to your question is, yes, it is a welcome development.
Yes, ma'am.
For two reasons. One is because it's a commitment that we can solidly and hopefully enforce. And two, because it sets a specific timetable. So I think our challenge is to make sure that we are there the whole way, pushing and making sure that it happens, and talking about what happens if it doesn't. So absolutely agree with you. And if I can add just a couple things on the services side, I think that certainly in terms of the future, one of the points that we like to make, which I think is very important, is the role that services plays in other sectors of the economy, like manufacturing and agriculture. So I just mentioned that because when you talk about how 8 out of 10 of us are in services jobs, if you look closely in manufacturing, 25 to 49% of the import in manufacturing is services. So a lot of the jobs that are being created in smart manufacturing, which is critically important to our future, are services jobs.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. I'm interested, Ms. Bliss, I think you said something along the lines that the aluminum and steel tariff issue is working its way out or something like that. Am I putting words in your mouth? And if not, if I am, please clarify that, and if you would sort of tell us what you meant by that.
I think what I meant more generally was that the administration approach to that particular issue, for which I claim no expertise and I'm not involved in with respect to my association, seems to be on a road. I am not endorsing it one way or another, but that's all my comment really meant.
Okay, thank you. Given the nature of the Chinese government and their desire for economic growth and stability in their political system, why in the world would they want to participate in a trade war with the United States? Did any of you have any comment on that or any response? Because it strikes me as counterintuitive that they would want to do anything that would create either economic uncertainty or political instability.
Well, I don't think they want a trade war. I think President Xi has spent the last 6-7 years consolidating power for reasons that are important locally.
He's done a pretty good job.
Yes. And if there is the potential of eroding that consolidation of power, then he and the nation will push back aggressively. And I think that's what we saw with the tit-for-tat discussions around tariffs. I think you raised an excellent point, though. One of the things I've learned over the years in visiting China is that there are Chinese companies and individuals within the Chinese government who have significant concern about the trade norms in China. And so part of the work is actually empowering those companies and those potential allies within China to begin to stand up on the need for China to align with global norms.
Several of you have mentioned we ought to be playing the long game when it comes to China, but I'm a little concerned about what happens in the near term, which may affect the long game. In other words, if China is able, through theft of intellectual property, undermining our industrial base by strategic investment in the United States, including startup companies that we may not even be on our radar screen, I just wonder how much time we have before they basically beat us in the near-term game so that long-term they are the dominant economy, and while they continue to build their project military power in order to protect that position.
You know, I think one of the issues that this administration, this president has brought to the table is the urgency of the situation. And I don't think, and my remarks on a bilateral trade agreement with China, that's not a long game. That's something we should be engaged in right now with real timetables to move this forward, because we've got to solve these issues now rather than later. The Chinese market, Mr. Garfield talked about the ICT sector. Think about autos that the senator from South Carolina, Senator Scott, was talking about. Last year in China, there were nearly 30 million vehicle sales. Contrast that to the United States market, about 17.5 million vehicle sales. We've got to be part of that market. We've got to find a way to grow in that market. And right now, the rules are stacked against us. We have old rules. We can bring them to comply with the WTO rules that are clear-cut. There have been many cases that the U.S. government has brought, rare earths, raw materials, auto parts, some others, where the rules were absolutely clear. China actually complied. But we don't have clear enough rules on a lot of these issues right now. We've got unfair trade practices that both Ms. Lee and I talked about. We need to make sure that our own rules there are enforced as well. But we've got to act now, and I think that's really important that the both of you have brought this hearing together today. But that's our message.
And Senator Cornyn, I think that's a really excellent point. I've been in this trade debate for a long time, for a couple of decades, and a decade ago this was an urgent question. And, you know, the AFL-CIO, where I used to work, was in partnership with a lot of small businesses that were also feeling that they were being completely undermined by China's currency policies at that time and others. And so, you know, I think the urgency is important. And in one sense, you know, you asked about a trade war. I know Clyde Prestowitz from the Economic Strategy Institute will say we've been in a trade war with China that they started a long time ago, and we've been losing. And so when we come to this, to the table.
I'm not sure we've been fighting back.
Right. Well, that's it, because we haven't recognized that we were in the war, and we come to the table very late. And you know, and I think that the current policies, the trade policies, the tariff policies that the Trump administration has put in place have not been well messaged, they haven't been well implemented, they haven't been thoughtfully addressed with respect to our trading partners, and yet we definitely do have the attention of the Chinese government, and I think you're right, that Mr. Garfield's right, that the Chinese government isn't looking for a trade war because we already have this tremendously imbalanced trade relationship. They can't even find enough you know, U.S. exports to put tariffs on because the imbalance is so great. So, you know, I think that the urgency is important, and I just wanted to quickly address the issue about agriculture and small business that were raised by your colleagues. That if you look at this, the immediate impact, I think people are concerned. You know, what will happen if there's retaliation? Will farmers be in the crosshairs? They will, and you know, small business will be impacted. But we need to step back and take the bigger picture that I think other people have also raised, which is that if we can address the totality of Chinese unfair trade practices, including currency, including subsidies, it will actually help both small businesses and farmers.
Well, I know, Ms. Dempsey, you said we need to get a bilateral agreement with China. Most of us are concerned with the more immediate concerns about Section 232, Section 301, and NAFTA renegotiation. And it's almost like our plate is overflowing, and the idea of undertaking something of that magnitude is daunting. But let me ask you again, there's been some discussion about TPP. I think many of us think the president has not been well advised when it comes to trade issues, and we're hoping that with Mr. Kudlow on board and with his track record that he will provide a more balanced advice to the president on these issues. But I've heard the president say that the 11 countries that entered into the TPP, absent the United States, have now come back to the United States to see if we would be interested in joining. Is that a real prospect? because it strikes me that TPP may be one of our best weapons. Weapons is not the right word. One of their best instrumentalities to try to engage China constructively on trade and to leverage our allies, as many of you have said we should be doing when it comes to dealing with China on trade issues.
I actually think this is a place where the Senate and Congress generally can be incredibly impactful. Two things. In recent conversations with Ambassador Lighthizer, he's raised that both publicly and in private. There is the question as to whether that's something this Congress would support. And so I think to the extent that there is clarity that it has a path to success, that would be incredibly helpful. And so anything that you and your colleagues could do to clearly communicate that, I think would be quite helpful. The second thing that has been really surprising to us in the whole back and forth with China with this administration over the last few weeks, particularly over the last few days, is just the lack of urgency in sitting down face-to-face with China to take advantage of the moment. And that's something else where I think some encouragement from Congress on Secretary Mnuchin, get on a plane and advance these negotiations in the immediate term so we can take advantage of what President Xi is saying. I think that would be quite helpful as well.
Well, thank you for that. I would just remind all of us that Trade Promotion Authority in and of itself was not an easy lift. And so the idea of actually approving some other trade agreement in this political environment is far from a certainty. So challenges everywhere. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to put something on the record to respond to the distinguished chairman of the Agriculture Committee, Senator Roberts. He and I might have a disagreement about when I was making points about workers, but I don't think this is one of those false choices where you can choose to support workers or farmers when it comes to China. Everyone loses if we don't confront China. They have really taken advantage of our workers and our economy. So I hope we don't get into a pitting one group against the other, because we're all going to lose if we don't confront them. And we have not confronted them. Neither party has done a very good job on this.
I thought he was just pulling your leg.
Well, I just want to make sure the record was clear before we move on. Now, Ms. Dempsey, I'm calling on you not only because you have roots in Pennsylvania, but it helps. I want to talk to you about IP theft, because I know we've been referring to a number of the consequences of our failure to confront China. And I wanted to start with Western Pennsylvania. I'm not sure there's been a county and I'm speaking of Allegheny County where Pittsburgh is, or a region of the state, region of any state, where there hasn't been more of a target placed by the Chinese government than Western Pennsylvania. They managed to hack into a number of institutions, whether it was U.S. Steel or the steelworkers or Alcoa or ATI, Westinghouse. The list goes on and on. Of course, a prosecution was commenced by then United States Attorney David Hickton, and then carried forward. The individuals took over for Dave Hickton, the acting U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania, as of when the statement was made, November of 17, said, quote, "Any company should be able to succeed based upon its ability to innovate and to compete without being sabotaged by cyber hacking," unquote. So companies invest millions, if not tens of millions, in developing technology and innovation to give them a competitive edge, and then that can be ripped away from them, and it certainly has long-term impacts. I guess I wanted to ask you to discuss some of those impacts in terms of what happens to a particular company on a number of fronts. Number one, what happens to their ability to be competitive, or to be as competitive as they once were or hope to be? What happens to their incentives to innovate and of course what happens to their jobs. Can you comment on all of that?
Absolutely, Senator, and thank you for highlighting that concern, because that is a concern. Our members in Pennsylvania, those that you mentioned, but also across the country that look at that, and that, you know, those were well-publicized cases, and it chills a lot of our manufacturers. And going back to the conversation about small manufacturers, can you imagine these smaller manufacturers too, and the impacts? And the impacts, right, are devastating. You know, companies are losing their trade secrets, their secret sauce of production, or their special formulas. And some of that you can never get back again. The concern that, you know, it's not just general counsel's offices, it's engineers are having about how do you plan and incentivize that growth going forward? How do you deal with that? And then the jobs impact. I think one of the things that we're looking at is, you know, how these cases are going in U.S. court. This is not something that's legal in the U.S. legal system, right? We need to make sure that the U.S. legal system has the right remedies to stop this, and to prevent this. And that's probably beyond my level of expertise in terms of the types of actions that we need to take. This is an issue that we're facing. You know, we face it domestically, we face it from other countries, but the concerns we have out of China are probably the most compelling that we're seeing here. And I think it is an issue that we need to stay on top of, that we need to be making sure that we do everything in our own domestic legal system. We don't need a trade agreement to deal with some of this. We can take care of these domestic actions right here at home.
Anyone else in terms of the company-specific or sector-specific impacts? Anybody want to comment on that?
And we talked.
Mr. Garfield?
We talked about electronic payment systems. When you look at China UnionPay and how much China UnionPay has grown since China entered the WTO, which it's now, I think, the #2 electronic payment processor in the world, while non-Chinese-based payment processors don't have access to the China market. It shows you the non-reciprocal nature and the impact it has, because those are jobs that were created there through China UnionPay, but are not being created here because we don't have access to that market, or those companies don't have access to that market.
Ms. Lee?
Just a brief point. I want to agree with Ms. Dempsey's points about the impact on workers, but also the importance for manufacturing, because we think of intellectual property rights as being for, you know, pharmaceuticals or for motion pictures or other things, but you know, the counterfeit auto parts and other things directly impact American workers. But there is a difference also when it happens in Allegheny County. We have certain tools. We can use the U.S. court system. When it happens in another country, which does happen when there's outsourcing, when American companies take their precious intellectual property and they bring it to another country where they don't have the kinds of protections, it's much more challenging. So it's just, I think it's worth noting that.
I wanted to highlight something that was submitted as testimony by the United Steelworkers. On page 2 of this testimony, they're talking about the auto sector and the consequences here, talking about a particular advanced high-strength steel used in the auto industry. And I'm quoting, "Companies in China have been unable to develop this technology and were under pressure from their domestic car companies to get it. So their company stole it for them." I'm sorry, so their government stole it for them, not their companies. So the government stole it for them. After the theft, one of the largest steel companies in China, Baoat Steel, how do you pronounce that? It looks like Bao Steel, I'll call it that, used the trade secrets to produce the specialized steel and export it to the United States in direct competition with U.S. steel, unquote. So that's what we're talking about. And we're either going to confront this or we're going to just surrender to it. And I think for too long we've been in a surrender mode. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator Casey, and thanks to each of you for helping us highlight this important topic. And I do think the slumbering giant of the United States government is starting to be awakened. And hopefully, we will be in a position to respond and to address these challenges in a way that protects our economy and protects our national security and protects our workforce, which is so important. I want to express my gratitude to Senator Casey and his staff for working with my staff to put together this hearing. And as a reminder, the deadline for filing any additional questions or statements for the hearing record will be 2 weeks from today. So with that, the Senate Committee on Finance stands adjourned. Thank you very much.